Hi, this is Jeremy Elkins with Untreated Art. On this episode, we will be creating an estuary coffee table using live edge black walnut and pouring silver epoxy with a high gloss finish. To get started, we surfaced the slab flat on both sides and removed all of the bark off of the live edge and in the inclusions. From there, we started burning rivers into the slab using high voltage electricity and water. Out of the many slabs I've burned over the years, I have never created the same river system twice. This is mainly due to the unpredictable burning patterns that you get when using high voltage electricity and water. However, for this piece, I wanted to take that one step further and create something that was absolutely unique from the others. Normally, I would start by burning one large central river that the tributary rivers flowed into. But for this piece, I decided to do something completely different and burn large rivers randomly throughout the surface. Instead of having it look more like a river system, I wanted it to appear as islands suspended in the resin. In order to achieve that look, I did away with the smaller tributary rivers for the most part, and continued to burn as many large rivers as the slab would allow me. As typical, the rivers did start out small, but grew to be larger as I allowed the electricity to continue to burn. I am able to control the width and depth of any river by allowing or restricting the amount of time the electricity is applied. If I want to keep the small rivers, I will stop the flow of electricity and move the probes over to a new area on the wood slab. In this case, I wanted them to be large, so I let the probes burn as long as they could. Even though the electricity will burn random patterns, I was able to get quite a few large rivers burned in such a small area, and achieve the look that I was desiring. This was a new technique that I hadn't tried before but been wanting to, so I was very anxious to see the final results. I really put this slab to the fire, and when it was finished, I had to douse it with quite a bit of water to get the flames out and all the inclusions and cracks. Once the wood dried out after a few days, I was able to go in and clean out the rivers. Until you remove all the charred wood from the rivers after the burn process, it's hard to tell what they are actually going to look like. Because I haven't tried this method before and burnt away over 50% of the top surface, I really had no idea what to expect. Once all the charred wood was removed, the islands really came to life and stood out. We didn't need to sand the top surface at this point because we're going to surface the entire piece flat after the epoxy pour, but it was really important to have a visual of the wood when pouring the epoxy. After sanding, it's ready to be placed on a polypropylene sheet and have a form built around it for the upcoming epoxy pour.
What we've got going on here is fractal burnt piece of live edge walnut, and we're going to be laying in an epoxy base to fill in these voids we created using this wood and house wrap tape, which allows the epoxy to be poured into the form, harden up, and then you can remove these walls later on. They won't stick to the epoxy. So before we pour the epoxy, we use silicone, and we silicone all the edges. That seals it off, creating a dam that the epoxy won't leak out. Of course, we double check that. We even apply multiple layers of silicone. We will be mixing up 12 liters of epoxy today, and most of that will all be the same color for the base. Some of that will be auxiliary pigment colors that we'll be using to add in our resin art later on. We're holding down the slab, pinned down to the table to keep it flat because wood will float in epoxy, and it also keeps this end down. You can see there's a crack here. This piece of the wood actually wants to lift up. So holding that down flat, once the epoxy hardens, it'll be cemented in there. It won't be an issue. At this point, we're basically ready to go ahead and mix up all of our epoxy and get started.
We start by mixing up 12 liters of resin, and for this project we're using Epoxy. The base color that we're going to use is a dark silver, and it'll be made up of a variety of different colors. Depending on the design, we will either use a dye or a mica powder for the coloring. In this case, we used a mica powder from Black Diamond Pigments. There are hundreds of colors to choose from when it comes to pigments, so we narrowed it down to our favorite 7 for the silver base. It's a range of colors that we wanted them all to be prominent in the base silver. Everything from white pearl, black onyx, battleship gray, even an oceanic blue. At first, the pigments will resist mixing into the resin, so you just have to keep at it. Eventually, it will darken up and all the colors will spread evenly. On larger batches of deep pour resin, I prefer to use a paddle mixer with an electric drill. It didn't take too long for the colors to disperse, but when mixing up resin, we always follow the manufacturer's recommendations. Off camera, we continue to mix in the resin, the hardener, for an additional 15 minutes or so. Now that we have it thoroughly mixed and the color is just right, we move it over to the vacuum chamber to get out the micro bubbles. While mixing the resin and hardener together, air is introduced into the epoxy, forming micro bubbles. While under vacuum, those micro bubbles will expand, come to the top surface, and pop. It can take some time for this process to be completed, generally 20 to 30 minutes depending on the size of the batch. As the bubbles continue to expand, sometimes the plume will reach the top of the lid, and you have to stop the process and knock them back down with a torch, then reapply the vacuum to continue. Once you're satisfied with the vacuum process, then you can pull the epoxy out and it is ready to pour. Off camera, we also mixed up 2 additional auxiliary colors, a dark silver and a white silver. Once we pour the base color, then we'll come back and add in those auxiliaries. I prefer to start by pouring in the large bays before moving into the inner rivers. With the large areas filled in first, I'll be able to control the flow of resin in the rivers as they won't pour into the bays. This will help me dictate the color scheme that I want for the rivers. There were a lot of inclusions and cracks in this slab, so it did take some time to let that resin settle into there. There's also a thin layer that will go beneath the slab even though it's laying flat on the table. Then we were able to continue on with the rest of the base pour. One thing to keep in mind is that we didn't want to fill the river system to the top of the level of the wood. We needed to make sure that there was room for both the auxiliary colors to be added, but also a thin layer of clear resin on top of that. The best way to ensure this is to evenly pour throughout the river system, let it settle, and add as needed. I really wanted a dense, prominent silver, and notice how you can't see through even a 1/4 inch layer of the resin at this point down to the charred wood. This is done by just adding in enough pigment powder to mask it.
Well, we'll just top off the rivers here. Poured 12 liters of epoxy so far. Probably going to need a little bit more. And this is just that base epoxy. We'll come back and add in the auxiliary colored pigments. You do a brighter silver, a black onyx, maybe a medium gray. But this is looking pretty good. It's a good start. Just looking for any areas that we missed. These rivers are pretty deep. But the color turned out good. You can't see through the epoxy even with all this colored pigment. It's a nice solid color. Okay, let's mix up a little bit more.
After mixing up an additional amount of base color and getting that poured, we moved on to the first auxiliary color, which was a lighter silver. Even though we already mixed in a similar color as this auxiliary silver into the base pour, by mixing and pouring them up separately, it changes the overall color scheme of the finished resin. Mica powders have a tendency to settle out as time goes on during the cure process. This can defeat the purpose of adding in multiple colors to your base pour. Even though you add in multiple colors during the mixing process, once it's settled, it may look as if there's only one prominent color at the top. Really, at the end of the day, this part of the process falls under resin art and is completely up to interpretation. There are an infinite amount of possibilities when it comes to choosing the colors for your piece. Each individual is going to have their own personal opinion on which colors and what methods to use for this part of the process. So long as you're happy with the results, that's all that really matters. You might notice that the auxiliary colors aren't fading away, they're not blending into the base. I find that this adds an element to the rivers that helps bring them to life, adding depth and movement to the resin art. At this point, I decided to help the process along by blending the colors together a little bit. I'm not stirring it up completely to fade the colors away, but I do want them to intermingle to create the pattern that I'm trying to achieve. The epoxy at this point is still very fluid-like, and as time goes on during the cure process, the patterns that I'm putting into the rivers are going to dissipate a little bit, so it's not going to be as structured as you're seeing right now. This part of the process is all about timing between the resin being a liquid and becoming a solid. If you start your resin art process too early, then it might all blend together and become just one solid color. If you wait too long, then it's the opposite and you may not be able to get them to blend at all. Here you can see the end result of the resin art, and it has softened up quite a bit during the cure process. Deep port resins do take quite a bit of time to cure, so a few weeks has gone by before we start removing the dams and popping it off the polypropylene sheets. Everything went great for the epoxy pour. We didn't have any leaks and the slab stayed flat to the table. After removing the clamps, we were able to start breaking away the dams that were held together with screws and silicone. The polypropylene tape that was wrapped around the dams did its job, and it broke away from the epoxy relatively easy. There's very little waste of epoxy because I kept the dams pretty tight to the wood. There is a thin layer of epoxy between the two, but that was just enough for a saw to trim off later on. Because we placed the slab onto a polypropylene sheet, which is similar to the house wrap tape, it doesn't take much effort to pop it loose. All it takes are a few wood shims that are placed around the perimeter every foot or so, and gently tapping those in until the table releases from the sheet. As we rotate the table onto its back, you'll notice that thin layer of epoxy I was talking about earlier that gets in between the slab and the polypropylene sheet. It's not much, and even with the wood clamps, it still gets underneath. Using epoxy means that there's always going to be a little bit of excess waste, but you just try to minimize the amount, which I think we did a pretty good job at here. Now we have a solid tabletop that is fully cured, and we can start shaping it. First thing we do is run it through the drum sander. Normally I use a router surfacing table to flatten both sides, but this 37-inch wide drum sander worked well for this small tabletop. It does take a little bit more time, but easier to work with, and it is a dual drum sander, so it has 80 grit on the front drum and 120 grit on the rear drum. We made sure to surface both sides flat, and on the top side we brought it down to the level of the resin, removing all the excess wood so that there's no gaps or low spots in the resin. Our initial slab was around 2.5 inches thick, and by the time that we surfaced both sides flat, we end up with around 2 inches. From here we can go ahead and make the trim cuts, which this one's pretty straightforward. There are 4 sides on it. We'll trim each side, make sure we got the accurate measurements. When using the circular track saw, I will actually make 2 passes per cut. That way I'm cutting them around 1 inch thick each pass. It doesn't burn the edges or dull the blade. Even with the vacuum running, the epoxy shavings does like to clog up the track saw, so something to keep in mind. Now we can move on to the finished sanding, and even though it came out of the drum sander at 120, I like to backtrack and go to 120 with a random oscillating sander. This will remove any of the deeper grooves left behind from the drum sander, and then we can work our way all the way up to 400 grit. At that point, we will raise the grain, resand with 400 grit, and then clean it for the finish. There are many different finishes that you can use on a piece that has wood and epoxy, but my favorite is the liquid hard wax. This type of matte finish is very robust for a hardwood and will bring out the natural beauty of the wood without changing its look too much. The 2 options that I'll give the client for this type of finish is to either leave the entire surface a matte look or to wet sand and polish out the resin so that you have a high contrast between the matte wood and the high gloss resin. This client decided to go with the high gloss resin finish. So after the multiple coats have been applied of this finish and cured, we can start the wet sanding process. During that wet sanding process, which is quite a bit involved, we will go from 500 grit all the way up to 8,000 grit before switching over to buffing compounds. When all of that is complete, then you end up with the same natural matte finish on the wood, but a high gloss glass-like finish on the resin. This type of finish is easily the most requested by my clients. The reason why I offer 2 types of finish for the liquid hard wax is because there are pros and cons to each. The The all matte option is much more robust and can hold up to heavy usage. Although the resin art won't be as clear as a high gloss finish, it will be far less prone to wear and tear. As many of you are aware, anything high gloss is very prone to surface scratches, such as the clear coat on your car, or even a flooded epoxy resin finish. I always make sure to educate each and every one of my clients on this, but at the end of the day, they do love the look of the high gloss finish on the resin and the natural matte look of the wood, so that's what they tend to gravitate towards. I was very happy how this piece turned out. My aim in the beginning was to step outside the box of the normal river system and create these floating islands of walnut suspended in resin. It's always fun and exciting to try something new, and I was extremely fortunate to have a client that was willing to go on this journey with me. When I first shared the concept of this design for his piece, I could tell that he was having a hard time to visualizing the end result, which was more than understandable because I didn't have a clear picture even myself. In the end, we both loved how it turned out, and I plan on expanding on this concept in the future. Thank you for watching and following along while we made this Estuary Island coffee table. Please let me know your comments or questions about this concept piece. My name is Jeremy Elkins with Untreated Art, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel at Jeremy Elkins for future videos.